Good afternoon. I was very tempted to say good morning, and welcome to today's Lunch and Learn around modern slavery. It's a basic introduction, but looking at it with connection to what's going on in Wales and the Welsh sector in particular. So hopefully you can all see the screen okay. This will be recorded or is being recorded, so please do keep your eye on any emails that come out afterwards. We will be sharing slides and links to the recording as we finish at the end of all of this. So welcome to today's session. My name is Helen Carter. I'm going to be your sort of facilitator and a little bit of a presenter today, but I'm going to go through the agenda and everything in a moment. Some of you may be familiar with me. I do tend to do the rounds a little bit when it comes to modern slavery, and I've worked alongside or been working on and off over the last few years with Sue in particular in this space around connecting into the UK and into the school. So I'm going to be your sort of host for the session, and I'll introduce you in a second to Sue Hurrell, who's the head of the Fair Work Procurement. She's going to be talking to you about supply chains in Wales, and to Josh Vuglar, who's the head of modern slavery and workers' rights within the Welsh Government as well. So we're going to get a really good overview of how modern slavery works within the Welsh context, and how you as organisations should be addressing these issues. This is a webinar. So the usual rules apply if you're familiar with the way that we run these things. All the cameras will be off. You'll see myself, and then obviously we'll see the speakers as they go through. We have a Q&A section though that you will have access to, so please do, and I encourage you strongly, any questions, any thoughts, comments, please put them into the Q&A section. If you're having any trouble, Rosie is in the background helping out with any technical problems, so hopefully she can help you with those. We have got a Mentimeter poll at the beginning as well, so please get your Mentimeter ready to answer some of the questions. And as I've mentioned, we do have slides coming out and a link to the video at the end of this as well, so we will be sharing that round. So hopefully we've made it interactive, even though obviously we won't be able to see you. So what are we going to cover? In a moment, I'm just going to test your knowledge to see how much you know around modern slavery. So this is an intro section, so that's very much around sort of what basic knowledge have you got. Then I will give you a bit of an overview around the current modern slavery world, what it looks like, the sort of trends that we're seeing, things that you need to be thinking about from an organisational perspective. And then I will hand over to Josh and to Sue, who will talk to you about Welsh policy and sort of guidance and development work that's going on within that area. And then, as you know, any of the sessions that we've done, we always like to give you lots of resources if you're interested. So we'll send you off to look at some additional resources, as well as focusing on some specific maybe due diligence actions that you could put in place. And we'll open it up at the end for any questions and answers. So what I'm going to do now, if you are familiar with the way that we work, you should have access to Mentimeter. Mentimeter, you can go on to www.menti.com, or alternatively use your app. Excuse me. Once you get in there, you'll be asked for a PIN number. So if you can put the PIN number of 80494132. And Rosie's very kindly put the link in the chat and the code if you need it. So please go in and have a look. The first question is really, really simple. It's a word cloud. So I want to get an idea of everybody on this call, what you're thinking when you think about modern slavery, what are the key words that spring to mind. So once you've gone in, code number 80494132. And the first thing that you should be able to see is a word cloud. So put the terms that come to, thank you, the terms that come, I was going to panic then, terms that come to mind when you think about modern slavery. So we've got some very enthusiastic people already. Illegal, yes, definitely illegal, hence why we're here. Exploitation is at the centre of it. So that one's obviously been used quite a few times. Human trafficking, be really careful with the terminology of human trafficking and smuggling. There is actually a very big difference, and that's the connection with the immigrants that we're seeing at the moment. Not every immigrant that comes into the UK is a victim of modern slavery. Not every victim of modern slavery is an immigrant. There is a connection, but they aren't necessarily a one-for-one. Low or no pay, yep. Excuse me. Cheap labour, misery, definitely injustice. Wow, you're all going mad now. Building sites, yeah, I've seen quite a few cases since I've been dealing with modern slavery over the last 6 or 7 years, a few case studies that have come through, and construction is definitely still a sector that we need to think about. Documentation is definitely a way that they're controlled. Eastern European, interesting. A lot of in fact, I'm going to show you a video and it happens to be Eastern European. Not every victim of modern slavery in the UK is Eastern European. Again, with the statistics that you see around modern slavery, a large proportion are actually, there's actually a UK individuals, English and Welsh and Scottish. Controlling, evil. Interesting, that's a small one. Yeah, I personally believe the same thing. It's pretty much the worst thing that I think anyone can do. Okay, let's see how much you know then around some of the key statistics and things that we start to see. Apologies, I have a cough. It's not COVID. Okay, so question 1 out of 7. This is multiple choice that you get an option for. So let's see how much you know. See how many people are joining in. Brilliant. I love all the little pictures that you get on this thing. Okay, let's start the countdown. So question 1, answer quickly to get more points, and let's see who at the top of the leaderboard. According to the Global Slavery Index in 2018, how many victims of modern slavery are there globally? 40 million, 41 million, 42 million, or 43 million? Ooh. Gosh, you're a pessimistic lot. It's very rare that I get to say the number's lower than you think. It's 40 million, or 40.3 million to be exact. So the 41 million, you're not far off. But the last estimate in 2018, it was around about 40.3 million. It's a fact that there are now more people today than in history ever who are working in slavery-like conditions, who are being controlled, who are trapped in some form of modern slavery. But be very careful of statistics. In terms of percentage of population, it's not as high as it has been at its peak. But because we have more people on the planet, there's more people to exploit, is the way to look at it from that perspective. So 40.3, and the Global Slavery Index is a useful resource to go and have a look at. It gives you the up-to-date statistics, particularly if you're going to get it into supply chains and supply chain mapping. Okay, next question. Sorry. Okay, question 2. So how many in the UK? If there's 40.3, how many victims did the Centre for Social Justice estimate were in the UK in 2020? 13,000, 15,000, 136,000, or 100,000? No, I'm going to say well done to the 12, because the Global Slavery Index did actually estimate that in 2020 there were around about 136,000. It's actually about 2019. There was a report done by the Centre for Social Justice, however, where they readjusted that down to around about 100,000. So the reality is, though, that when the Act came out in 2015, it was estimated there were around about 13,000, which is why that figure is in there. We have seen a significant increase since the Act came out in 2015 in those estimates. A large percentage of that is down to things like county lines. So if there's any parents on the call, be careful of your kids. It is about those vulnerable children with the drug trafficking across the different county lines. We've seen a huge increase in that across the UK, unfortunately. But the reality is that regardless of the figure, it's higher than we've ever thought. The other challenge you have with any figure is it's a hidden crime, particularly in the UK. So it's not easy to understand what those figures are, but it's definitely within those sort of tens up to hundreds of thousands that rather than the 13,000 that we first thought. Okay, let's have a look at the next one. So third question. The Modern Slavery Act only applies to businesses with a turnover of 36 million. Yes or no? This one should be a real quick answer. Come on, guys. Am I going to see? Oh, not quite 100%. Nearly, not far off. It's something that everyone still thinks today, unfortunately. The Act itself applies to any person, any business. It is illegal to traffic. It is illegal to get involved in exploitation. And you'll see a little bit later on some of the businesses that are now under the spotlight around sort of civil litigation. The 36 million, that bit is only about the statement. So if you have to produce a statement, if you have to produce information around what you do, that is tied to the £36 million threshold. However, as we see legislation come in across the country, as we see businesses start to say, no, we need to know more, that 36 million becomes a little bit more irrelevant, because we're starting to see big clients in sectors saying, I don't care how big you are, I want to see what you're doing in this space. Produce a statement. And we'll go in a little bit later on about some of the due diligence that's required. If you're doing all that work, produce a statement. It doesn't make sense not to. Okay, question 4. Is the Modern Slavery Act, which of these is not considered modern slavery? So there's 9 categorizations of modern slavery, 9 particular things: forced labor, forced marriage, criminal exploitation, or money laundering. So which of these crimes is not under the Modern Slavery Act? Excuse me. Well done to those that got that right. Money laundering is not covered by the Modern Slavery Act, although you may find that money laundering is included as a crime. So, for example, one of the biggest prosecutions when the Act first came out in the car washes was a car wash down in the Milton Keynes area, where they raided a car wash, found people who were being exploited, and around about £2 million worth being laundered of money, drugs, guns. So it isn't always that modern slavery is the only crime. It's one of a multitude, but the money laundering isn't covered. Forced marriage is. Now, by that I mean forced marriage, not arranged marriage. They are different. So forced marriage is included within the Modern Slavery Act, as is criminal exploitation. So criminal exploitation could be anything like insurance fraud, debt fraud, credit card fraud, benefit fraud, all those sorts of things. They're included under the Modern Slavery Act. Okay, last couple of questions and then we'll get into the detail. From the total number of global victims, what percentage is attributed to forced labour? So out of that 40.3 million, how many or what percentage is forced labour? 68%, 10%, or 22%? Well done. Yeah, it is correct. 68%. It is the biggest contributor to modern slavery. 22% is sexual exploitation, prostitution, which most people tend to immediately think of when you think of modern slavery. You think of the sex trade. That's actually 22%. Obviously, there are some countries where that would be higher than forced labour, but the reality in terms of global percentage, that is 22%. 10% is what we call government state sponsored, government endorsed, government delivered modern slavery, if you like. So one of the hot topics right now is things like the Uyghurs in China, where the government basically forces its people to work in certain industries and trades so that they can support supply chains. Okay. Modern slavery is profitable. That's why it's such a big trade. What is the estimated income generated for criminal enterprises through modern slavery? $80 billion, $100 billion, $150 billion, or $200 billion? Yeah, you've all gone for the more expensive. It's definitely profitable. It's around about $150 billion. That's more money than the US banking system, than the tobacco industry. It is known as probably one of the most profitable across the globe. And it's because it's tied so intrinsically into the supply chains, into products, and it's an incredibly difficult crime to prosecute. And you can keep you can keep exploiting people time and time and time again to get more and more money. Interestingly, the most profitable region on the globe for modern slavery is Europe. In terms of the amount of money that can be generated. And that's mainly because we do pay very well within Europe, but we don't always necessarily check that the money is going into the hands of the people who've earned it. So just by saying you're a living wage or you're paying fair wages, great, but there is a final check that needs to go on to make sure that these aren't then in the hands of the exploiters. You're not paying a living wage that's going straight into the exploiters' hands in some of those lower areas. So have a think about that. Okay, last question. Excuse me. Let me see who's won. So, which of these are signs displayed by victims of modern slavery? They may appear withdrawn, signs of physical abuse, signs of PTSD, or all of the above. It's sort of a trick question that should be relatively obvious. It is all of these and more, and we'll go a little bit later on into those signs. I think, that you'll be able to see, but it's usually physical signs that you need to check for. They might appear withdrawn, they might not speak English, or they're just not very good communicators. PTSD is another one to look for. So things like mental health first aiders, there's a lot of work going on in construction at the moment. There's a great video online in the school that Kira put out at the moment on how they've trained mental health first aiders to look for signs of modern slavery and be that first port of call on construction sites, because it tends to be those softer things to look for, not just checking bank accounts, checking cards. Look for those softer, more behavioural pieces as well. So well done to all of you that got all of those. It is a mixture of all. Okay, I think we have a leaderboard. Well done, Sarah, apologies if I've done that incorrectly. You have won this one. Dr. Centipede, I love some of these names. Congratulations, you're second. So all give yourselves a complete round of applause. And there's some good knowledge there, which is really good. Okay, so before I hand over to our Welsh counterparts, looking at what we're doing within that space, let's just have a quick look at some of those key things that we were talking about through those stats. One of the things that's always important to remember when it comes to modern slavery is that the Act isn't just there to give us a bit of a problem to look at. It's because there's a real person behind a lot of the challenges. So I always like to make sure that people understand who we're helping through the Modern Slavery Act, not just the fact that businesses need to do their due diligence. And this is a really interesting story.
I needed to earn enough money for my daughter for her school, and I was told about a good job in England, so me and 2 others took it. We were picked up and driven to a port. We went on a ferry to England. When we arrived, they said we were going to work for good money, so we worked very hard for long hours to finish the job well. But when we finished, we never got paid. Instead, we were locked up. They forced us to do more work. They would beat us and threaten us if we didn't finish the work. We couldn't go anywhere because they took our passports, ID, and money. We were stuck. I felt hopeless, totally powerless. At this time, I knew I was a slave. I felt very sick, hungry, and tired all the time. I was sold from person to person, bartered for right in front of my face. I heard a man say I wasn't even worth 300. I felt worthless, like rubbish on the floor. I wished that I could die, that it could all be behind. I finally decided I would rather be killed trying to escape than stay. I knew one man who lived a long way away. I had no money or transport, so I had to walk as fast as I could, or they would catch me. My legs are bad because they beat me, but I had to keep going. I walked for 10 days straight with no stopping. Look, these are the shoes I found. They are the wrong size, but they are all I had. When I was walking, all I could think about was the traffickers. They are chasing me. They will find me. I was very worried. I thought of my daughter too. I had let her down so much. I felt shameful. Hope for Justice have been very good to me. I didn't expect any help. I thought I was finished. I am so happy to be free, to be alive.
So it's important to remember that in most cases, what we're seeing here is real extreme abuse, and modern slavery is about that. Modern slavery is the most extreme form of exploitation. Exploitation in our industry in construction happens on a variety of scales, and there are elements that we look at when we look at equality and diversity and bullying and poor payment terms and conditions, and that's part of what we start to see from some of the legislation, for example, that's coming through from Wales about the fair work, making sure that everybody's being paid fairly. Modern slavery, however, is the most extreme of this. This is about individuals being trapped, feeling they have no choice, no escape, and are basically indebted to people. They're controlled and trapped either through coercion, through documentation being taken, through debt bondage, whatever that happens to look like. So when we talk modern slavery, it is that most extreme that we need to be thinking about, even though I recognize that exploitation happens on a variety of different lenses. So modern slavery, as we've mentioned, has forced labor, sexual exploitation, criminal exploitation, domestic servitude. Other ones you may not be aware of are things like organ harvesting, forced marriage. They're all covered under the Modern Slavery Act. But from an organizational perspective, you need to be particularly interested in things like the forced labor, because that's your organization and your supply chain. Be also aware of the fact that criminals don't really care how they get their money. So I was working on a project on the A14 with the supply chain manager who wanted to train his team in modern slavery, particularly worried about an FM contract because he was worried about the fact that they had people who were living on site for a week, and he wanted to make sure that there was no cleaners that were being exploited doing the cleaning job and then being sold off as prostitution in the evenings. The criminals don't care how they get their money, they just maximize as much as they possibly can. So sometimes there are interconnected bits that you need to be aware of. When the Act came out, there were certain trades that were identified. The reality is that if you actually think about where exploitation can be found, it can be found in anything. There's a really interesting website to go on called slaveryfootprint.org. I've done mine, and you can actually put in what you consume on a regular basis in a year, for example. And I've done mine, and I have about 50 people who are working in slavery conditions associated with what I purchase on a regular basis, and I try and buy ethically. The reality is that from the moment you wake up to the moment you go to bed, you will probably have something in your day that will have contributed to some form of modern slavery, not necessarily in the UK, but potentially within those elongated supply chains. But we see it in things like agriculture, car washes, bricks, construction, domestics, smart tech, bail bars, PPE, uniforms, tomatoes, strawberries, avocados. It's literally in most things that you can buy on a regular basis. So be aware that it's more prolific than you actually realise. The other thing to think about is the fact that we've actually got more and more focus on modern slavery now. So while I talked earlier on about the fact that the Modern Slavery Act transparency requirements only covers 36 million or above, the opportunity to create civil litigation and to sue organisations who don't have good due diligence in place is non-discriminatory. It doesn't care what your turnover is. If you have not undertaken due diligence, if you've not looked at the processes that you have to ensure that you are either not employing somebody who's being exploited or going through a recruitment company or a subcontractor, you are opening yourself up to some potential problems with due diligence. And the biggest one we've seen so far that is probably closest to home is Biffa. They were part of, they've been sued by 3 victims who were part of the biggest prosecution so far in the UK called Operation Fort. That was in 2019. There were 8 controllers who infiltrated a recruitment company and managed to bypass the systems as they were the only Polish speakers, and they trafficked 400 victims from Poland into the UK and then placed them in various different supply chains, agriculture, manufacturing, and 3 victims found their way into Biffa through the recruitment company, the temporary labour agency that they'd used. Excuse me, just to let you know, Biffa have been signatories of Hope for Justice, have been real big organisations against the Modern Slavery Act, and the case at the moment that's going through court hasn't been completed yet, is that there was a failure to identify, a failure to support. So when we talk due diligence, make sure that your systems don't just look at that hard stuff, but you focus really strongly on spotting signs, teaching people to look at those softer sides of things, because you can tick all the boxes you want. If you don't then use your eyes and ears to identify these people, they can slip through the net. So that's the most high profile one. And in fact, in North Wales, we just literally saw, just before Christmas, I think it was, the care homes that have been infiltrated by a particular family who put individuals into those as well through a labour agency. So it is local, it's global, it's things that you need to be aware of. So before we go into the context that you need to look at, as I said, reiterate that the Act itself applies to everybody. Trafficking and exploitation and being involved is illegal. Obviously, as we get to smaller businesses, you just need to make sure that you are doing the right checks, checking the right things, and obviously working with the people that you are doing. And as I said, this compensation piece is putting more and more onuses on businesses now to make sure that you are doing all the checks you need, not just yourselves, but also through your supply chains. Then finally, if you do a transparency piece, and I'll go into due diligence very quickly at the end, I'll do one slide that will talk to you about the sorts of things you should be doing in your organisation. But all of that should contribute to your sort of supply chain statements that you are looking at in place. The Act is going through refresh as we speak, although it's taking an awful long time. But the reality is that all that's happening is it's getting more and more difficult to sort of pull in woolly statements. Statements need to talk about what activity you've undertaken, what risks you've identified, talking about what sectors you operate in, and also really importantly, if you find somebody, what do you do? What's your grievance and remediation process? It's one of the weaker areas we see in businesses. Not just training yourselves, but also training your supply chains, training people that you're getting involved with. And the statement is a year-on-year progression. It's a long road to go down. So it's about producing that on a regular basis. So that gives you a quick overview around the world of modern slavery today, what it currently looks like, how some of the legislation is going in. Excuse me. What I'm now going to do is pass over to Josh, who's going to start to give you a little bit of the Welsh context, and then Sue, who'll give you some of the supply chain. So Josh, just tell me next when you need me to go over, but I will hand over to yourself.
Thank you so much, Helen, and thank you for the very good introduction and the very engaging quiz that you shared with us. And thank you everyone who's taken the time to attend this event today. And I'm very pleased to be here supporting the Supply Chain Sustainability School event on modern slavery. So yeah, I'll be talking a bit about our work in Wales around modern slavery, and then my colleague Sue will be talking more around what we do around supply chains. I think it's really important to highlight, first of all, that modern slavery is very much a challenge in Wales. We have the same issues as in England, and we have a really difficult time combating the various forms of this crime that it takes. So firstly, I'm going to share some statistics with you, and then I'll talk more about the structures and approach we have in Wales to combating this crime and the kind of policies and priorities that we're taking forward. Fundamentally, our approach is about how we prevent modern slavery from taking place, how we identify and support victims, and how we tackle supply chain transparency as well. So if I can go on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So at the moment, in 2021, the most recent data we have is up to the end of September 2021, and we had 336 suspected victim referrals taking place through that time. The graph, the kind of map we have on the right shows the referrals which came through from the 4 Welsh police forces, but I should really emphasize that's only about half of the total number of suspected victim referrals we had in that time. The rest of the referrals came from other first responder organisations, so organisations which under the Modern Slavery Act have the ability to refer suspected victims of modern slavery, which include local authorities and key third sector partners as well. And that 336 referrals we had up to the end of September 2021, that is the largest number we've had in that kind of time period so far, which I think is mainly due to increased detection capabilities and is really in line with similar increases seen in England and in Scotland and Northern Ireland as well. We see that the largest number in Wales are children, and that's been a trend which has been happening through recent years, where the numbers of children relative to adults has been increasing. Most of these children we find are criminally exploited. A lot of that is linked in with county lines activity and with low-level drug offences, particularly cannabis. But it also includes significant numbers of children who are victims of child labour exploitation and child sexual exploitation as well. We find labour exploitation is the main form of exploitation reported for adults, but that's closely followed by also criminal exploitation and by sexual exploitation as well. So we have very, very significant challenges with all these different forms of exploitation in Wales. We also, unfortunately, have had cases of different types of exploitation as well, such as domestic servitude, which is a particularly hidden form of modern slavery, linked in with things like forced marriage, which is very difficult to detect because the exploitation is taking place primarily in a domestic setting, so particularly significant issues there. And in Wales, we have modern slavery not just taking place in Wales, but also modern slavery in terms of victims who have arrived in Wales. So the majority of referrals in Wales are for UK nationals, but we have very high numbers as well of citizens of different countries. Eastern Europe has been mentioned, but also from Southeast Europe, from Southeast Asia, from West Africa, and from different regions as well, including the Middle East and Afghanistan too in recent times. So we have very much different forms of exploitation taking place. We also at the moment have a national transfer scheme, which is a UK scheme which is transporting or resettling survivors of modern slavery who are entering through the ports in Kent to local authorities across the UK, including in Wales as well. So we have that encountered as well. And I should also mention that in Wales, at the moment, so at the moment we've seen that kind of number of really increasing really across the board. So very much a significant challenge for our first responder organisations in combating this crime. So I'll go on to the next slide and talk a bit more about the processes and structures we have in place. So in Wales, we have a Wales Anti-Slavery Leadership Group, and that brings together the representatives from a range of agencies and organisations in the public sector, and also some of our kind of key third sector partners as well to organise the strategic response to this crime. In Wales, modern slavery is a reserved policy area, so that means that this is an area which the UK Parliament has responsibility for legislating for. So that's why in Wales we also share the Modern Slavery Act 2015 in common with England. And we work very closely with the Home Office on this agenda. So the Home Office is part of our Wales Anti-Slavery Leadership Group, and right now my team in Welsh Government are working with the Home Office on the development of a new strategy for tackling modern slavery in England and Wales, which will be published later in the spring this year. In Wales, BALSO are the organisation which have responsibility for the modern slavery victim care contract, and that's a contract which is subcontracted from the Salvation Army, which has the kind of national contract for England and Wales through the Home Office. That modern slavery victim care contract basically means that BALSO are the main organisation which support adult victims of modern slavery and also their dependents as well, such as their children, in terms of providing key services and support and helping them to integrate into the community. So BALSO do a really, really important job in terms of being that kind of contract provider, and in terms of providing a range of services, including places to stay and including outreach support to victims of this crime. In Wales, we also have the Independent Child Trafficking Guardianship Service, which is run by the children's charity Bernardo's. The Independent Child Trafficking Guardianship Service do a really important work liaising with the local authorities in Wales to ensure that child victims of modern slavery are being looked after and are being supported. So they do a really important job liaising with local authorities and also liaising with other statutory services as well to make sure that children victims of modern slavery are receiving that kind of support and are being integrated into the community. I talked a bit about modern slavery referrals. So just to give a bit more information about that, in England and across the UK, we have a national referral mechanism. So as I alluded to, when there is a person who is suspected of being a victim of modern slavery, they are referred to into that national referral mechanism by what's called a first responder organisation, which is a range of organisations such as law enforcement organisations, including the police and the Gang Masters Labour Abuse Authority and similar bodies, along with local authorities in Wales and in England, and also key third sector organisations as well. Those decisions are made centrally, primarily by the SCA, formerly known as a Single Competent Authority, which is a part of the Home Office, which has the main responsibility for determining whether someone is genuinely a victim of modern slavery or not. And there's two stages to that decision. There's a reasonable grounds decision made within 5 days of that person being identified, which identifies whether there's a reasonable grounds for that person may be a victim of modern slavery. And then there's a second stage called a conclusive grounds decision, which is made after a much longer time period, after the submission of more evidence, which is the conclusive decision whether that person is in fact a victim of modern slavery or not. And during the period between that reasonable grounds decision, that person is provided with a range of support by statutory authorities. But in Cardiff and in Newport and Gwent, we have a devolved pilot where support is being provided by where the local authorities in those areas are making those decisions. I'll just go on quickly to the next slide, which talks about sort of the work we're doing in Wales. So we're looking at the moment in terms of the governance of modern slavery in Wales and about how we plan for the future. We're focusing very much on how we support victims and survivors, looking at the long-term provision of support for people in those situations. We're looking at how we make sure that equality, diversity and inclusion is central to our work. We're looking at how we particularly target different sectors where there are particular issues. We've talked a bit about the agricultural sector as a particular issue. We've talked about construction and also about social care. So those are some of the areas where we're looking at how we target our messaging. We're looking at supply chains and the code of practice, which my colleague Sue will talk about. And we're also looking at how we do training, awareness, engagement, and also how we build our evidence base around modern slavery as well. I'll pass on now to Sue, who will talk a bit about our work on supply chains and about that area of work.
Hello, thank you. I'm going to be very quick because I know that Helen's got more material to get through at the end as well, and we are going to be pushed for time. Some of you will probably have already come across, in fact I know that some on the call have come across our Code of Practice on Ethical Employment in Supply Chains. We published it back in 2017. It isn't only about tackling slavery in our procurement, in our supply chains, in our contractual activities organisations. It looks at a spread of employment practices from both from the good end, as in, you know, paying a real living wage, through unethical practices like unfair use of zero-hour contracts, where the balance of power is wrong in the relationship, employment relationship, through unlawful activity, false self-employment, and then through to dealing with trying to put processes in place to manage the risks of slavery in supply chains, both within the UK, for example, on construction sites, etc., within the UK itself, but also what we can do to address risks of slavery in supply chains, which is obviously overseas, which is obviously much more difficult. But that is the aim of it. It's currently a voluntary code, and the aim of it is to really, those that sign up, to take a number of commitments to address risks of unethical practice and to promote positive practices around people. Coming from just the angle really, where, you know, perhaps in the past we've thought about sustainability more about environmental issues and maybe local economic issues, and we've had a bit of a blind spot to people, and I think that's changed in recent years, and this is the Code of Practice was Wales' early response to that. Could we move on to the next slide, please, Helen? So we've got around about, you know, over 350 organisations signed up so far. It'd be great if it was more than that. We have, we're just getting to the stage where we're really starting to put more resource into this within Welsh Government. It has been an issue for us in recent times, particularly with COVID, etc. So what we're doing at the moment, you know, we're 4 years after we've published the code, having a review of it. Josh and I are working together on that. Josh is leading that piece of work with a view to updating it. And then we need to fit it alongside some new developments. One of the things that people have criticised the code for is that it's voluntary. There are elements of the code which obviously relate to legislation, so they are mandatory because they're law. But what can we do to look at the code and think about which bits of it actually have to be applied? What can we make more mandatory? And that's where I think we've been, it needs to fit alongside some work we're going on some new legislation, which again, many of you will be familiar with if you're involved at all in selling into the public sector. Then you'll know that there's new legislation coming on procurement as a result of us having left the EU. So actually, can we move on to the next slide as well, please? Thank you. So there are 2 bits of legislation on procurement happening. The second bullet point here refers to the UK government's reform, and it's primarily around the procurement process. What we're doing is putting together a social partnership and public procurement bill, which looks more at the policy expectations and outcomes from procurement, and the reporting, and then transparency and oversight. So what we've got within that legislation, and it was published in draft, so you could see the draft version of it. We're still working on the final version, which is due to be published sometime sort of early on this calendar year. It has a socially responsible procurement duty, which is placed on all public bodies. It'll have an impact on you in business because you will obviously need to understand it if you're bidding for public work. But the duty itself is on public bodies. Overarching one, that's economic, social, environmental and cultural well-being goals need to be built in, and fair work goals need to be built into all procurement. Objectives will need to be set, particularly around larger procurements, those above the thresholds where things have to be advertised, and large construction is a particular focus. Organisations will have to publish strategies. They'll have to publish annual reports with data. It's all about transparency, greater accountability, and there being some oversight, there being feedback mechanisms for those who have identified problems in the way procurements are either run or handled. And then the opportunity for detailed investigations built into the legislation for ministers. Could you move on to the next and final slide then, please, Helen? Thank you. So what I wanted to talk to you very briefly about today, because we haven't got much time, is some specific a part of that legislation which is around about contract management. As far as we know, there is no model for this elsewhere. This is kind of new legislation in Wales, where we're actually requiring public bodies to apply particular clauses, particularly in construction and also in outsourcing contracts, which I won't talk about today. And those clauses will have to be included there's an expectation they're included in all large construction contracts, and they're passed through supply chains, through all tiers of supply chains within the UK, and that they are managed. And that those three elements, they need to be included, and they need to be passed through supply chains, and need to be managed, are expected. And public bodies that aren't going to do that need to report to Welsh Government. That's the mechanism of how it works. We haven't drafted those clauses yet. We're in the process of starting to think about exactly what they will need to be. They'll need to be short and focused in order to be understood and monitored throughout supply chains. And as it happens, the supply chain school secured a contract to work with us on a piece of development work for that, and that work is going on at the moment. So if you want to get involved, I'd really encourage you to get in touch with the supply chain school and offer your views really on the sorts of things that ought to go into clauses that are monitored through supply chains in the construction industry. Those are the categories that are in the draft bill: prompt payment, making employment opportunities available to disadvantaged people, upholding employment rights in supply chains, adequate training for workers, making opportunities locally available, and then some very important ones around environmental sustainability. So it's not just about fair work and anti-slavery, it's around the broad description of what we describe as socially responsible procurement, but fair work is right there in the middle of it. So yes, please do get involved if you've got experience or ideas to bring to bear on that particular piece of work. I'll hand back over to Helen at that point.
Brilliant, thanks Sue. Yes, please do get in touch if you do, but what this is starting to show you is the need for better understanding of supply chain, better transparency of supply chain, and the fact that I think everyone was hoping that this might go away, but it's not, and it's getting bigger and bolder as we see this within our industry. So you're starting to see, not just from Wales, but we'll see it in the UK through the social value, in England, through the UK Social Value Act. There are more and more emphasis now on what we start to bring within procurement, and deeper dives into supply chain, better understanding. So what I'm going to leave you with is a couple of things to have a think about. We've talked to you about the fact that there is legislation. We've talked to you about what modern slavery is, how it is possibly a bit more prominent than maybe some of you have realised, and a bit more local, but it's also international. If you want to go and learn any more, we do have lots of training courses that can dive deeper into procurement, can dive deeper into due diligence. But whatever your organisational size is, you need a process to understand where your risks for modern slavery sit, and then how you adopt due diligence. And there is going to be more coming from legislation that will ask for evidence of how these processes work. Obviously, they can be big and complex, they can be small and simple. It doesn't have to be a one size fits all. Your processes are suitable to you, but fundamentally they need to cover things like who is accountable, who is responsible in your business. Is it just legal? Hopefully not. Is it HR? Is it procurement? Is it a mixture? Is everybody responsible to look and report? How is it held within your businesses? What training have you undertaken? If you've learned one thing from today, that's great. But training isn't just sheep dip, go on a training course online for an hour and we suddenly know everything. This is what does procurement need to do? What's the business case, I say in inverted commas, at board level? What's the requirement in HR and recruitment? How do we make sure that modern slavery considerations or due diligence is weaved into everybody's competency, and obviously is fit for purpose, it's relevant to what they do. That we need to understand about measurement and reporting. There are actually quite a whole suite of measurements and metrics that are out there, but it's still quite early days for modern slavery and exploitation. We can look at, you know, how many victims have you saved? How much positive engagement have you done? I would suggest not getting to that point yet. I would suggest the first thing you need to be looking at in measurement and reporting is how many risks have you identified? How much of your supply chain have you trained and engaged with? How many of your executive understand what it is? How much of your team know and have been on spot the signs? How much of your organization or your supply chain has grievance and remediation? So initially start on management metrics, what I call management metrics rather than outcome metrics. And when you're doing things like modern slavery statements, the management metrics at the moment are what they want to report. They want to understand how much you've done in terms of transparency. I'll very slightly underplay this, but it is probably a big, bold headline. Risk assessment is important. You are all a variety of different sizes of businesses. You're all going to have different sizes of legislation, of leverage. You're all going to have different procurement routes, but the idea is that you focus on the risks to your business. So if you are an organisation that never uses a labour agency, that you do direct employment, then do you know what? Don't focus on labour agencies. They're not a risk for you. But if you are a tiling company, then actually you might be thinking that uses temporary labour, then you might want to think about temporary labour, but you also need to start thinking about your quarried materials, the slate, where it's coming from, because eventually that's where it's going to get to. So all of the legislation that is out there does give you that ability to say you can put a risk proportion, you can put a proportional lens on it, and you have to anyway for public sector, but it is the most common sense thing of any of the legislation that's out there. Focus on the risks and then apply your due diligence. Engage with stakeholders, the schools, I'll show you in a second, the huge amount of resources we have. Communicate, talk to your competitors. There's a strange thing, because the reality is that nobody wants to compete on modern slavery. It's not a competitive advantage. In fact, it's in everyone's interest that you try and address this. So there's been some really good work through the school, through working with people like Sue in Wales, where collaboration is key in some of this. And in fact, when you get into your supply chains, collaboration, stakeholder engagement is going to be the only way you can make some real significant changes. It isn't going to be as simple as contract terms and conditions. So engage with as many people as you can, keep up to date, keep up to date with all the intelligence, and continually communicate. Sorry, my cursor just gone. Supply chain and procurement. Lots of different strategies you can adopt, whether it is buying certain labels, whether it is looking at certain schemes, whether it is looking at your ITTs and your pre-qualifications. There are a huge range of supply chain strategies. Just pick the right one, but understand that you have to get smarter and closer to procurement. And if modern slavery isn't the motivation for you, then supply chain resilience should be. Transparency is no longer just the domain of modern slavery. You should be getting better at understanding what's going on in your supply chain, because there are now so many issues coming up that you need to be looking at it from a continuity of supply perspective, efficiencies. So this is not something that is going to go away. We need to get smarter at our procurement. What do I do if I find somebody? What's my grievance and remediation? Who do I ring? Who do I call? They always want to say Ghostbusters after that, but it's not Ghostbusters. It's people like the Modern Slavery Helpline, the police, law enforcement, Samaritan, Salvation Army. Josh did a great job of telling you some of the schemes that are currently coming through the Welsh Quarter. So think about who it is you contact and what support is out there. But due diligence is not about zero slaves. At no point is this that you will be able to stand there and put your hand on your heart and say, we have no slaves. And in fact, if any statement or policy says you have no slaves, it means you haven't looked. It means you don't know. What you're doing is trying to find and fix. Find where it is, put it right. And then obviously, as you get into the supply chains, that's how you do. So all sorts of things we've gone through today. There's a huge amount of resources on the supply chain school, both from a Welsh perspective, from an English perspective, from a European perspective around the due diligence. We've got e-learning modules, we've got data guidance. If you're thinking I don't buy anything, well, there's a procurement guide that tells you how to, literally what ITT questions you can use, what PQQ questions. There's little toolbox talks and shorts. There's checklists on how to do modern slavery due diligence, how to assess a modern slavery statement. Seriously, there's so much in there. There's possibly too much, but it's all free. So go and have a look. It's available for anyone to use. We've got learning pathways, so you can go in and have a look at modern slavery, a huge range of documents, e-learning modules, introductions. There's stuff for site, so how to set up a construction site. There's stuff focusing specifically on due diligence. And basically the pathways just give you a load of resources to have a look at that you can do in your own time. And then you get a lovely little badge, because everyone likes little badges, to say, I've done this pathway, thank you very much. And it gives you sort of that progression through the subject matter. So there is really no excuse to say that you can't find anything, because there is a huge amount out there at this present moment in time. And as Sue has pointed out, modern slavery is part of a continuum of people issues, of the interconnectedness of the fact that people are complex things. We are complex things, subjected to a lot of different issues within our industry. So if you're not familiar, then we have the People Matter Charter, which is about organisational response to how we treat our people and how we deal with the fact that our industry isn't loved by all. And we need to recruit quite a few people into the industry and deal with those issues. So we currently, I think, have about 123 signatories since it launched at the beginning of last year, sorry, 2020, which is really good. So please go and have a look at that. It's a useful resource to do. So, as we always do through these lunch and learns, we've just probably bombarded you. You may have choked on your sandwich with a few things that we've spoken to you about, but it is a sort of small window into the issues around modern slavery. My parting advice before I open for questions and answers is this is not something that changes overnight, and it's not something that changes with tick boxes. What you're looking for from an organisational perspective is to be the tortoise, not the hare. Small, steady progression changes, and there's a huge amount of support and resource. And if you don't think it's a hot topic, then just go and have a look at what's coming down your procurement routes from clients now. It is becoming more and more prominent, particularly with public sector. So do go and have a look. What I'm going to do now is just open up some questions in the Q&A session at the end. So I've seen there are some in the chat. While I do that, Rosie, I don't know if you've already done it, you might have done it already. Yes, she has. Go and have a look in the chat, and Rosie's put the link to the feedback session. We always want to know what you think of these sessions and how we can do better and things that we can improve on. And what I will do now is just quickly go through the questions I have in the chat. So bear with me. Hi, Sarah Jane. The final check when paying living wage, I think you were referring to the fact that I talk about the fact that you need to make sure people are having their wages. The key is to make sure that they're going into people's bank accounts. When you are checking that people are being paid, that you don't have that replication of 6 people on the same bank account. Go and make sure that you're paying that fair wage and that people are getting access to it. Those are the sorts of checks that you need to be making. So those are your tick box checks, if you like. Nobody has more than 6 people don't have the same bank account, the same house, same mobile numbers that you need to be thinking about. Ian, you wanted to know how many people took part in the quiz to see how well you've done or not. Probably there were 28, so you can find out how you're doing on that one. Robert, you asked about the slaveryfootprint.org. Yes, that is the link. I will send the link round though to everybody. So it's www.slaveryfootprint.org, and you can go and calculate your own footprint when you think about your own things that you purchase. So that is fine. Bear with me, I've got loads of internal conversations going in here as well. Peter, hi Peter. Yep, so Peter is a chair of a working group that the utility sector is currently doing, and that's cross borders. We have numbers of different organisations from different countries, UK countries involved in that. And in fact, we are going to be running a due diligence lunch and learn next week, I think on the 19th, which is going to take that one slide of due diligence and go deeper into it. Go and have a look at those. It might not be country specific, but the reality is that regardless of whether you're Wales, Scotland or England, the requirements are not that dissimilar. So it's worth going and having a look. Paul, the recording will be available. I will make sure that everyone has it. Rosie sent the feedback form, and I think a lot of people are now saying thank you very much and can I go and have my lunch. Procurement links to modern slavery and the ITT questions, yes, I will send those through. Sarah, I'll take online around the bank account checks. We've got some videos on some of the checks that you can do, so again, I'll send that through. So, whistle stop tour. Lots and lots for you to go away and have a look at. You may want to watch the recording again if you think you've missed anything. I do appreciate sometimes I talk a bit fast, but hopefully it's given you a good overview of some of the things to think about. And we will send out, as I said, the slides and the recording link, and we will also just make sure that we've got some of those key documents to you as well. And Sue and Josh have very kindly said that they will circulate their slides too. So from my perspective, thank you so much to everybody who's attended. Big thank you to Sue, and a big thank you to Josh for co-hosting with me. And dead on 1 o'clock, go and have your lunch. Have a good day, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.